Well, they are going to have to pick one. It's either A or B. Ukraine's offensive into Russia's Kursk Oblast just keeps turning into a bigger story. Let me show you what I mean. The international border is here, and the extent of Ukraine's offensive is out to here, with 3 separate salients continuing to push forward. In total, Ukraine is operating in roughly 625 square kilometers of Russian territory, which exceeds recent monthly gains for Russia by quite a bit, with the caveat that we are comparing apples to oranges, as Russia is trying to hold the land, and in contrast, we still don't know what Ukraine's long-term plan is here. And although I'm sure everyone in Kyiv is pleased with the results, collect a bunch of Russian land is not much of a war strategy. So, today, we are going to open up the black box of Phase 2. In particular, we will look at the nuclear aspect of this. Fortunately, not the mushroom cloud type of nuclear, but rather the power plant type. Why that is misleading, how the Kremlin faces a defensive dilemma with how to allocate its troops, and why Ukraine may be more interested in that Russian troop deployment than anything inside of the Kursk region that it has invaded. Generally speaking, the public discourse is thinking about the situation as the location having dictated Ukraine's strategy. But we might be better off deleting that, and instead thinking that a predetermined strategy has simply found a location. War is always an adventure. Oh, and we will also cover speculation about shakeups at the top of Russia's military, and all of the problems that Russia now faces with Ukraine moving behind the defensive lines they have formed. But let's begin by dispelling this now common guess that Ukraine is trying to reach a Russian nuclear power plant. Specifically, the facility in question is the very originally named Kursk nuclear power plant. It is, if we zoom out and pop up some handy pre-rendered lines on maps, just under 60 kilometers from the border with Ukraine. The basic logic here is that Russia has held the also very originally named Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant since March 3rd, 2022. Oh, and keep this image in your mind for later. Obviously, Ukraine would like it back. So, as the logic goes, Ukrainian troops capture the Kursk one and trade it for the Zaporizhzhia one. Now, to be clear, I do not know what is going on inside the heads of the powers that be in Kyiv. But goodness, it would be a silly strategy if this were their endgame, and it has nothing to do with the distance. Let us count the ways. Oh, wait, one more. For starters, a like-for-like trade makes for a cute story, but it is not how things work in practice. Goodness knows I too enjoy a cute story. Heck, these videos are essentially cute stories with some lines on maps thrown in with a stamp that says science. Science. But Kyiv is not doing this for the storytellers in Hollywood, or even silly social media channels. If you want a nuclear power plant back, you do not need another nuclear power plant to get it. You can trade any other land for it. You just need to settle on the quantity of goods being exchanged. In that light, Ukraine may be trying to accumulate value for the purposes of ultimately proposing a trade. Say, Ukraine evacuates Russian territory, and in return Russia leaves the Kharkiv Oblast. And then afterward, there is a tacit understanding that the north-south border will not be an active theater of combat. But again, we find ourselves in a situation where Ukraine would be trading a nuclear power plant it holds for non-nuclear power plant land. On to the second problem. Supposing that a nuclear power plant trade did occur, it would not solve the main problem associated with Zaporizhzhia. All of the reactors are now in cold shutdown, meaning that they are no longer active and no longer generate enough residual heat to boil water. Thus, a Chernobyl-like event is literally impossible at the moment. Cold does not mean cold, though. They may still be upwards of 200 degrees Celsius. Then you have spent fuel pools that also require long-term cooling, and on top of that, there are dry casks that contain still radioactive materials. As such, the main danger here is sabotage. Perhaps to the electrical grid to stop the cooling process, or perhaps to the spray ponds to eliminate the cooling water, or perhaps to the dry casks. Yes, casks are meant to withstand an airplane crashing into them. But the effects of repeated artillery strikes is a wild card, and probably one you should not feel comfortable with. But hey, at least those dry casks have nets to stop drones. The point is, Ukraine being in physical possession of the site does not preclude Russia from sabotaging the place from the outside. All it prevents is Russia doing it from the inside, or firing up the reactors again, which could set up greater dangers. Now to number 3. There is a more general strategic problem with the site itself. Remember how I told you to keep this image in mind? Well, the power plant sits on the opposite side of the Dnipro River, which makes sense from an engineering perspective because such facilities need a ton of water. But for our strategic purposes, what is Ukrainian control of it supposed to look like exactly? Should the lines on maps be like this? Or this? Physical possession at that point would be in name only. Russia would de facto control it, with the ability to recapture the site at its whim. Finally, there is a political problem. No one in the West would go for this. Revelation that capturing nuclear power plants was a part of Kyiv's goal would immediately prompt an endless parade of very angry phone calls from Western leaders. So let's get rid of this as an idea. But we should also discount the idea that this is merely some sort of publicity stunt. Ukraine is bringing some top-tier equipment into Russia, including Strikers and the Bradley fighting vehicles that it had to beg out of the United States back in 2023. These are not what you would want to put at risk if your goal was just to generate some meme headlines. Ukraine is not trying to win silly points here. Rather, you would want to execute some quick hit and runs. Basically, the bare minimum to qualify as a feint. Thus, in search of better answers here, I first want to zoom out on perhaps what might be guiding Ukraine's bigger strategic thinking. Doing so will flip the script, as hinted at earlier. Again, it may help to think of the invasion location as being a convenient place to implement a predetermined strategy, rather than the location dictating a strategy. That is not to say that Ukrainian troops are ignoring what exists in Kursk. They will still happily blow up rail lines and such. Just that they are not wanting to hit Kursk infrastructure specifically. In other words, infrastructure is the target, but whether it is in Kursk, or Belgorod, or elsewhere, is irrelevant. To get down to what may be Ukraine's strategy, as a starting premise, someone will have to remove the Ukrainian soldiers from Russia. You cannot claim governing legitimacy while simultaneously having Ukrainians running around uncontested on your soil. Indeed, it appears that the Kremlin understands this. The Kremlin's official website has released 4 transcripts from 4 meetings about the situation in under 48 hours. That is uncommon. In fact, the last time that I can remember a recurring discussion like that related to the war was during Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin's Thunder Run on Moscow. Another big difference there is that the Kremlin was slow to have any official response to the mutiny, whereas they are being far more proactive about this. Now, broadly speaking, the Kremlin has 2 options. Option 1 is to use elements of the volunteer army that is currently in Ukraine. Option 2 is to use the soldiers who are part of the ordinary conscription laws on the books in Russia, which annually brings in a cohort of men ages 18 to 30 for 1 year of in-country service. Emphasis on in-country. It is tempting to say that the conscription option is the obvious choice. After all, they are the untapped resource, and their entire service is restricted to within Russian borders. It is sort of the point of its existence. And that may be the case, but the choice is not as straightforward as it first appears. Think for a second about who is involuntarily paying the costs of war, particularly within Russia. It is tempting to point to the Russian soldiers as the answer, but that is not quite true anymore. Now, obviously, they are the ones who are losing limbs or dying. And back when Russia was not using volunteers, but instead had to use conscription to fill its ranks, they would have unequivocally been the correct answer. And some of the conscripts are indeed still there. But the question was who was involuntarily paying the costs of war, and the logic of economic exchange muddles the current picture. Those who are heading to the front now are doing so in exchange for hefty signing bonuses. As their label suggests, it is a voluntary exchange. Yes, it is tainted by how fewer economic opportunities in the periphery bias those individuals to join, but it is voluntary nonetheless. The involuntary exchange comes from people who are paying for the war to happen. Mostly, that falls on the economic elite within the country, who will ultimately foot the tax bill one way or another, and those who are disproportionately hit by the West's economic sanctions. Finally, it is also striking those hurt by inflation. That covers anyone who is storing their wealth in cash reserves, but usually concentrates on pensioners living on fixed incomes, and poor people who live paycheck to paycheck. However, that last group is actually doing fairly well right now, despite 8.6% official inflation, at least compared to before the war. Half of the consumer inflation formula is due to rising wages, as the war industry is requiring more warm bodies for production, and factories are having to compete with the Russian Ministry of Defense's wages. To be clear, this volunteer army strategy is the economically efficient thing to do. It is a big reason why the United States switched over to a volunteer force in 1973. It also does not guarantee that discontent within the military is impossible. If soldiers sign contracts expecting a casualty rate of, say, 10%, they are liable to think that they got a raw deal if they later discover that it is closer to 50%. But, broadly speaking, it means that the more serious threat to Putin's rule for the moment comes from home. Now let's put that in context of Ukraine's invasion. Again, the Kremlin can choose between the volunteer force currently fighting in eastern Ukraine and the conscripts currently in Russia to defend against the Ukrainian incursion. Picking the volunteer force keeps everything voluntary. It would just be a change of scenery. Switching to the conscripted soldiers would shift who is involuntarily paying the cost of war to an entirely new group, not only the conscripts themselves, but also to their family members. This is in contrast to the family of Kremlin-recruited soldiers, as they benefit from the wages sent home by their loved ones. As a result, the Kremlin faces a dilemma: create a new political problem by sending in the conscripts, or withdraw troops from the Eastern Front, which will eventually lead to a premature end to Russia's summer offensive. As I said at the top, it's either A or B. Now, if that is what Ukraine is doing, it is a clever strategy. You cannot force the Kremlin into the same dilemma by sending another Ukrainian brigade to the front lines. And there is some risk that it will backfire if they start having to fight a larger cohort of Russian soldiers. But they had to go into Russia for this to work. And that might help us understand why Ukraine chose this particular location. Maybe it is not special for the features that it has on the ground. Instead, perhaps that way over there was just the best place to cause chaos and force the Kremlin into the predefined dilemma. Now, Russia knew that cross-border attacks were possible. Ukraine even sponsored some previously. But this did not magically absolve the Kremlin from that dilemma. The question for the Russian Ministry of Defense was how to mitigate the risk across a relatively large international border. We have discussed the standard defensive algorithm before, but the basic idea is that you ought to spread the risk out evenly everywhere. So, if this part is naturally incredibly weak, you either build stronger defensive lines or deploy more soldiers until it balances out with the next weakest part. Then you evenly increase those two weakest parts until they equate with the third weakest location. Take a deep breath, wash, rinse, and repeat until everything is equal. The reason for this is that your opponent usually gets to observe your allocations and then can choose where to go based on that information. Thus, if you overprotect your stronger areas, the enemy just hits your weakest point and renders all of those reinforcements elsewhere irrelevant. Of course, this is how such defensive allocations work in a vacuum. In practice, the defender does not know all of the strengths of the attacker. Consequently, it must do the best it can without that information. As a result, it may end up with a weaker point despite its best efforts. In turn, what drives where the attack goes can be something as innocuous as a small bit of private information that Ukraine has. For example, It may quietly know that the weak point in Russia's defenses is here, and so it just goes with the flow. Or maybe, more broadly, Russia was not anticipating that the United States would be okay with such an operation, so defenses along the border were generally weak. And then the Kremlin was surprised to hear Pentagon Deputy Spokesperson Sabrina Singh basically say, "Yeah, that's cool with us." Whichever factor originally drove it, the consequences seem to be consistent with what we are observing on the battlefield. Ukraine has advanced well past Russia's defensive line, exactly the type of outcome you would hope for if you knew the place was weak. Ironically, this is also what Ukraine had hoped to do last summer, only for those expectations to fall flat. But no one is thinking about that now, least of all in the Kremlin. The problem for a defender when you break his defensive line is, well, now the land itself is no longer an impediment on your assault. You can also go around to cause further breaches elsewhere. This is why we are seeing a salient forming along the west and another going north. That does not mean that Ukraine is unstoppable here, just that it will require Russia to overcompensate with soldiers. For its part, the Kremlin realizes how bad the problem is. After initially dismissing the situation as having been resolved, we now have a series of very public announcements. Essentially, the Kremlin is trying to show that they are somewhat in control of the situation. But are they? Ukraine is striking substantially deeper, either to protect what is happening in Kursk or to set up something more. And there are reports that Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov ignored reports that Ukraine was gathering troops along the border. Then he was not present at a Security Council meeting, leading to speculation that he might be out of a job. Now, it is true that he was there for this original response meeting. He's the one on video conference, and he was not present for the later one. But this was a Security Council meeting, and this one was not. Gerasimov is not a permanent member of the Security Council, and you can see from these other photos of earlier Security Council meetings that his absence is not uncommon. Regardless, the point is that all of the progress is indicative that Ukraine's strategy may be location agnostic, rather than the location dictating a strategy. And speaking of things that are not being dictated, how about my books on the strategy of the war? Sorry, there are no audiobooks for them. They would take too much time away from my video production, and that hits a much larger audience. But if you don't mind reading, then check out the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.